All right, it's that magical number, 2 minutes past the hour. You ready, Justin?
I'm ready. Let's do this.
All right. Okay, thanks for joining us today, folks. We're going to be going through the 2024 State of Production Readiness, some of the key findings, and some suggestions as well. We are your hosts. I am Lauren Craigie. I look after product marketing here at Cortex. I also wrote the Production Readiness Report. Fun fact, I used to be an analyst at the beginning of my career at the IRS, actually. So if anybody got away with some fraud between 2009 and 2012, that's probably my fault because I didn't really know what I was doing back then. But Justin, I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks for that. I think you saved me actually a good chunk of money.
Oh,
And
perfect.
yeah,
You're
no,
welcome.
I'm Justin React, head of DevRel here at Cortex. And my background is primarily in software development. I've written code, done enterprise architecture, and most recently have focused on developer productivity and better developer experience through IDPs.
Awesome. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about this 2024 State of Production Readiness. It's our first time running this survey. What we did was we used winter survey tools to send out a survey to 50 engineering leaders from global companies with 500 plus employees. We kind of wanted to go for that higher end of the spectrum. We have a number of folks at 10,000 plus employees in that survey as well, but you can see the full breakdown if you actually go and access the survey online. Most of the questions were pertaining to production readiness checklists, tools, perceived effectiveness, and also hopes and dreams for the future, what people would like to see automated, what they want to see change about the space. Um, I did do a lot of different slices of data as I was looking at this. I would have loved to do more benchmark related data by industry, but there actually weren't a ton of statistically significant trends by industry. There were a few by company size, and we're going to talk through some of those. But yeah, I thought that in itself was pretty interesting. But let's go ahead and get into it.
Yeah, I've been incredibly excited about seeing how this data kind of pans out because it's one of these, the way that we handle production readiness now as an industry is kind of like one of these lingering anti-patterns. Like I think we can all sort of relate to like the 4 hour SWAT calls. We're in the middle of a cloud migration and we move some service over to the other cloud and we want to make sure that everything's ready to go before we turn it on and start accepting traffic. And that can be hours on the phone or some long Slack channel or something like that. So being able to see like a real like viable solution for this problem, for this anti-pattern, I think it's so important. So I'm really excited to see what we came up with here.
Yeah, if nothing else, if you walk away from this webinar feeling like, all right, I'm not really alone in this. Other people are facing the same challenges or about at where I am at in my journey as well, then that's also, I think, a good outcome. Just to give a bit of context on what Cortex is, of course, this webinar sponsored by Cortex. It's an internal developer portal that unifies engineering data, teams, and tools. So the goal here is to reduce friction for developers to build and ship software that is safe, aligned with standards on a continuous basis in order to make their lives a little bit easier, to make sure that velocity is high, to make sure that software health is high as well. We're backed by Sequoia and IVP. We have 53 million in the bank. We're Series B, and we have a number of very large customers. This will probably be the last time we talk about Cortex specifically. After this, we're going to be just talking about the survey results. And then later on, we're going to talk about the value of IDPs in general. Anything else, Justin?
No, I think that's a good start. Let's get into it.
Sweet. Okay, so 6 key findings. Then we're going to talk about how we kind of see the space evolving and how IDPs help. So trend number one that we saw, and now I don't really expect people to zoom in and look at the individual bars here and what they're labeled. I'm sorry, the graph is like not super helpful, but I'm just going to give a summary of kind of some of the findings here. Interestingly, nobody really had the exact same production readiness checklist. So what you're looking at there on the right is a whole bunch of different things that people could have chosen as part of their production readiness checklist. The light purple bars are how often people selected that item as something that they personally do. And then the purple, darker purple jagged line is where people noted that they were struggling with. So maybe they're doing something, but they're having a hard time enforcing it. As I said earlier, there were no statistically significant trends in choices by company size, vertical, or method used to track production readiness. So I thought that was really interesting too. Most people are kind of have a different process that's unique to their business, which we would expect. That kind of makes sense. However, interestingly, we saw some trends here in what is very easy for folks and what is very hard for folks. The easy things I don't think are that surprising. Everybody has CI/CD integration. If you're going to build something, you also want to be able to deploy it. Connection to logging and monitoring tools seem to come up a lot as well. So these are the top 3 that we're looking at here that pretty much everybody is doing right now. and a PR complete as well. So these are kind of routine things that probably shouldn't surprise anybody as being normal parts of production readiness. I did see some interesting things in the harder things, though. So ensuring SLOs are defined, maintaining acceptable test failure rate, and ensuring connection to vuln management solutions. All the sorts of things that require a little bit of cross-pollination with other groups seem to be a little bit harder for folks. But Justin, there's one trend in here that I wanted to get your take on. Connection to logging and monitoring tools seems easy. Connection to vuln management solutions seems hard. And I don't really understand the difference between those two things and what would make one easier or harder. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that first of all, I think this data really speaks to sort of the sophistication of the problem, the sort of like deceptive sophistication of the problem of production readiness. But specifically when it comes down to vulnerability management solutions, like log shipping is pretty straightforward. Like an event is happening in the app, I'm shipping it out, hopefully because I'm nice and 12 factor and it's going off to my log aggregator and it's monitoring and it's just very much a broadcast and there's not a lot of back and forth that's happening. Vulnerability management is much more complex because first of all, there's a lot of different types of solutions and not a ton of ubiquity behind how you integrate with those solutions. Some of them scan code directly, some of them look at artifacts that are upstream, some of them scan repositories. And then you also have to spend a lot of time being disciplined about tuning these vulnerability management solutions. So they tend to throw false positives or they tend to suss out vulnerabilities that may not be exploitable, right? So there's also, I think, a question of, have we attached to the vulnerability management solution and is it even configured the right way? So I think what you're probably seeing here in the data, it's probably people answering the question, I think a little bit more broadly, beyond just making sure that this thing is connected to vulnerability management. Is vulnerability management as efficacious as it should be based on configuration and the type of scanning that we're doing?
Okay, so they probably didn't read that as like a binary yes, no. It's like technically connected. Like, is it actually working for us in the right way? Is the whole process working correctly?
That's my supposition, just
Mm,
because of the ambiguity that I know exists when you put these pipelines together already, right? I mean, it's not as simple as just like turning on static code analysis, right? I mean, you're going to start getting all of these indicators that may or may not be relevant to your code base. And there's a lot of diligence that has to happen after that to make sure that the tools are doing what they're supposed to do.
okay. And then what about that ensuring SLOs are defined? What do you think makes that more challenging?
Well, like defined where, right? I mean, I think like when one of the great things about using a portal for a pattern like this is that we're able to integrate with all the various systems that would be telling us whether we're meeting our SLOs, and we're able to kind of change those SLOs sort of agile and on the fly. Kind of again going back to our cloud migration pattern. You may be migrating out to multiple regions or multiple availability zones, and you may have different SLOs per region. And that's really hard to solve for when you don't have a central system of record that's also accounting for all your services and endpoints.
So the takeaway there then, did you plan this? Because I think that married up really well. So takeaway here is it's a pretty hard problem to solve. We haven't had technology to ensure continuous alignment like that for very long. And so if you're in that same position and those same things are hard for you, you're really not alone. It's interesting to me that, again, across companies of all different sizes, a lot of people are struggling with those same things. The next thing I want to talk about here, and it's related to that, is that most teams are managing their PRR meaning the production readiness review process, with multiple different tools. You've got project management software, you've got Confluence, Git. All those are mostly popular, especially with smaller companies, but it's definitely happening at larger companies too. And this slide is not meant to shame anybody in any ways. Like, it's very common for teams to be using multiple different types of tools. You'll see that the use of IDP is still up and coming. I would say the space is a little bit newer. We are in IDP, so I know this firsthand that the market's still evolving, so not everybody's really using it yet. It tends to right now be in a little bit larger companies. That maybe tends to be when the Confluence wiki spreadsheet becomes sort of untenable. Justin, before we get to that, like 33% there having no process. What are your thoughts here on this spread of different solutions that we're actually looking at?
I mean, it's not surprising to me, right? This is like sort of a microcosm of the larger problem of not having standards around minimally viable platforms and not really having, I'd say like a commoditized sense of like what the platform should be per business. I mean, I think that's a problem that we're trying to solve for in the industry right now. And I think the data is reflecting that. I think that this is also correlating some of the data that we saw in trend one, where people tend to use tools that are closer to their silo. This is just Conway's law in action. If you're familiar with Conway's law, the way that teams tend to communicate with each other will reflect the way that they build their systems. And it's loose interpretation of that law. And the way that we would see this pan out is sort of the same thing, right? You would have inside of silos and inside of spheres of influence in a company, they'd be settling on a piece of technology and using that to collaborate. As soon as you try to do that cross-functionally across other teams that have their own subcultures, then things get really difficult. And we saw that, right? We saw the cross-functional problems were really hard for businesses in trend one. And now we kind of see why, right? Everyone's using sort of a disparate topology to manage this stuff. None of these solutions, I would say, let's be really clear. I don't think any of these solutions actually say that we can help you solve for production readiness, right? None of these solutions were like tuned specifically for that use case. Instead, they're just being used because it's a container that gets you 70% of what you need. But I think this is, again, going back to my statement about our current readiness handling being an anti-pattern. I think this is why, right? We don't have solutions that were intentional for solving this problem.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about the use of project management software as well. Like obviously one of the highest used tools for production readiness right now. And at first when I read that, I thought, are we talking about like Trello and Monday and Jira? But there's definitely more sophisticated software project management tools out in market today. But I think at the same time, most of them are not designed to be reading from across your entire stack and actually understanding the status of the thing autonomously and being able to say, hey, these few things are misaligned and you're going to need to take action. And so maybe therefore that's why you combine it with something else, like another ticketing solution, to be able to read that information, decipher it yourself, and then tell somebody else to take action. Is that probably what's happening?
I think so. And I mean, you mentioned that there's, a set of tools beyond these ones that are listed here, things like Codebeamer and IBM Doors and stuff. But the problem is like these tools are commoditizing just as the project management philosophies that they were built around are starting to fall out of favor. And we're like moving into this new world of commoditized DevOps and platform engineering. So you nailed it, I think, with the lack of integration in some of these systems, right? The real-time monitoring of the systems that are involved in the platform and in the value stream is what's missing from a lot of these solutions.
Yeah. Okay, it's time to talk about that no process group there.
Ooh.
I'm sure that's much higher than I would have expected for people to admit that they have no process at all for production readiness. What do you think could be happening behind that number? What do they consider to be no process?
I think, well, maybe it makes me wonder, first of all, if I think everyone culturally has some process for making sure that we're good to go and we're not going to break stuff when we release to production. But maybe a lot of these processes haven't matured to the point where a company would say, "Oh yes, this is our production readiness process, and we're very proud of it." Because again, going back to it, I know what the reality of this is. For most people, it's a long multi-hour SWAT call, like a big conference call. Or more recently now, it's some long, chain in Slack. But none of those things are what I would consider to be like a formal and well-organized and agile process for dealing with production readiness. None of those solutions account for easy rule exceptions, for instance, and none of those solutions account for being able to at the last minute change a readiness standard and then immediately beam that to 100 different teams that might be stakeholders in that release, right? So I think what you're seeing with this 30% is maybe people being a little bit self-aware and saying, oh gosh, yeah, we kind of get on the phone and like make sure the service is good to go, but I wouldn't really consider that a formal process.
Yeah. Also, I just saw a comment in the chat, a note from somebody that larger companies have people that focus on surfacing these problems, which I think was related to this slide, which does make sense. Yeah, there's definitely larger companies maybe have the luxury of having a dedicated group of people that need to think more critically about this. Smaller companies need to move faster, need to get things out the door quickly. You have a little bit more time, I guess, to worry about more of like the reliability, the repeatability elements. Is that fair? Or am I speaking completely out of turn?
No, I think you're spot on. And thanks,
Okay.
Tim. Tim and I are friends IRL, actually.
Oh,
So it's nice to hear from him in this Q&A. Good to see you. Hope you're enjoying the webinar. Yeah, you're spot on, right? I mean, larger companies have larger numbers of cross functions, and what that data really bore out in trend one, and we're starting to see here in trend two, is that the more silos and the more teams that you're having to coordinate across multiple stakeholders, the harder this problem is, and like exponentially harder. Because who's going to update the spreadsheet when something changes? Who's going to be responsible for the service if that service owner leaves, right? You just don't have the ability to broadcast these standards easily. So no, I think, Tim, your point is spot on. Thank you for that. Yes, the more functions you're trying to align on production readiness, the more difficult this problem is. And hence why the IDP is such a great solution, a single system of record that everybody can log into and look at.
Let's move into, before we do that, takeaway. Right. So having more than one system of record means you have no system of record, which is a
Yes.
little bit of tough love, I think. But again, it's very normal to have lots of different tools for different purposes. But I think the point of a single system of record is that every different tool that you have is feeding into that one place so that you are not managing multiple versions of truth.
I think it's the same. We've all experienced, if you've been in a career long enough, you've probably been in a position where you've had more than one boss. And then sometimes it feels like you don't have a boss because it's like, who's the decision maker? Or, you have a project that has multiple owners. So it really doesn't have any owners because you don't have one single decision maker. And the same problem exists here. If you have multiple systems of record, guess what? You don't have a system of record because by nature, that system of record, if it's not an anti-pattern, has to be the one and only system of record.
Yeah. I'm going to switch off this slide because I'm noticing it's giving my skin like a purple hue, and I'm just not into that right now. So we're going to
Matches my shirt.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. So moving to trend 3 here, everyone, asterisk, there was one person in the survey who did not see any negative consequences. Great job to that guy. But a lot of people have seen consequences of poor production readiness. That's how the question was phrased. Not just have you seen these things generally in your career, but in the place that you're at right now, have you seen a consequence of failing to meet production readiness? And the person should be able to say, yes, I can tie the issues that we have there to something negative that's happened. So some of the top issues here: increased change failure rate, increased mean time to resolve or remediate, decrease in developer productivity. A lot of those things do correlate strongly back to some of the slides that we were just looking at, the inability to enforce kind of continuous measures, continuous testing, continuous standards. So what happens in that situation? You may end up having more fire drills for things that maybe could have been avoided, which means that you're going to have lower velocity in shipping things out, which means you're going to have lower dev productivity, which means you're going to have unhappy developers as well. It was kind of surprising to me, Justin, to see that so many people noted vulnerability exploitation. Is that surprising to you to see that number above 25%?
Now, that number actually, I think, is way lower than reality would bear out. I think probably have folks who just didn't want to maybe admit that they've been exploited, or even more frighteningly, don't know that they've been exploited, right? One of the, I think one of the sort of textbook production readiness checklist items, would be that a code scanner like Sneak or SonarQube or something like that would be able to say, okay, we're not finding any critical vulnerabilities in your code, right? That would be something that you would align on. Hopefully your vulnerability scanner has been properly configured so that there's some level of accuracy to that. But it doesn't surprise me at all that that for folks who have less of a formal process, that yeah, sometimes this slips and sometimes you end up releasing code with a vulnerability. And I mean, let's be really, really clear, right? 99% of the code that we're pushing right now is not our code anymore. We're all downloading open source dependencies, and we're just sort of trusting that those authorities are okay and that they're putting clean code. And that's the whole reason that we have SAST and DAST and Salsa and all these, this new
Salsa.
DevSec.
There's a salsa category.
SLSA,
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, wow.
And so we've come up with these sort of remediation strategies, but there's still plenty of vulnerabilities that haven't even been discovered that are just sitting out there in the code. So what I think that reality would actually bear out that many more people have released vulnerable code and have possibly even been exploited, and may not know it. That's just the nature of AppSec and DevSecOps.
Yeah, I think if engineering managers are answering yes to that particular question, yes, I think that we've been exploited from a lack of production readiness. I'm sure that what they're saying there is like, we're probably not going to avoid all vulnerabilities or all bugs. That's not realistic. But what is realistic is to have certain SLOs for being able to remediate those things, or not letting it get out of control, or being able to set parameters that say, I don't want there to be more than 2 PU1 vulnerabilities on this particular piece of software for longer than a week. And that needs to move up to the top of the, engineers escalation ladder to make sure that that's something they're focused on first. So I would I think it took a lot of like bravery and humility, I guess, for the people. Obviously, it's kind of an anonymous survey, so maybe not super brave, but a lot of self-awareness to say, yeah, actually, I think that we could have done better. We could have probably resolved things faster, and that would have stopped the exploitation from happening.
I, I mean, I think that that's spot on. And I think what you nailed is that there's a real need for sort of agility here because, we know that things change very quickly. And sometimes, we have to prioritize business velocity over what might be maybe a critical vulnerability that's showing up, but we know the way that our app is coded that that's not actually possibly part of the attack service or part of the threat landscape. And so we make an exception, right?
Yeah.
Having a system like this that's changeable, and that's real time and that can be used cross-functionally is a really good way to deal with this volatility. We have a question too about whether we feel existing code scanners are effective. There's a need for new tech. I don't want to deviate from what we're talking about. I believe there is a need for new tech. I would go check out what Open Rewrite is doing with Dependapot in GitHub right now to have a glimpse of the future of open source remediation, but that's not what this webinar is about. So.
Okay. Let's move into the next one before we get there. So, yeah, one of the things I wanted to reiterate here is a lot of the top consequences that people are seeing should now feel very obviously mapped to an inability to have continuous monitoring across all elements, across all of the tools that you're using. So not just continuous monitoring of performance or continuous monitoring of vulnerabilities, but being able to bring those into the same space as the ability to say, I want to make sure that we have the right testing coverage. I want to make sure that we don't have more than 3 open vulnerabilities. I want to make sure that we don't have more than 5 open tickets. I don't want these things to start to stack up and then act as a distraction for developers who then are doing a lot of swivel chair because things are escalating faster than they would have expected.
Yeah, it's the continuous monitoring of this piece that really makes all the difference. There's no need for manual updates. There's no need for someone overseeing this.
Good segue into this one now
Yeah.
to show that a lot of people are not doing continuous monitoring right now. But again, that is something that we kind of expect at this point where the market is right now. IDPs enable a lot of this more holistic continuous monitoring, but they haven't been around for a very long time. So you do have a good number of people saying, yes, we continuously monitor alignment to all standards right at the top there. Then it's kind of a mixed bag here. Once a quarter seems to be a standard amount of time for folks. But then there's a large number of people saying we actually have no process for monitoring things once it's gone out of house and it's been deemed production ready and it's out there in the world. Unless something comes up, unless there's like a vulnerability or something that needs to be repaired, then it's not something we actually think about on a daily basis. What do you think about that, Justin?
No, I mean, I think that's it, right? I think that if you look at the progression and evolution of tools and how people have aligned processes to kind of what's available, I think there are folks that are really like just sort of getting comfortable with like the table stakes of an IDP, which is just the system of record. I mean, I think you have people who are just starting to get to the point where it's like, okay, wait a minute, like we need a better solution than spreadsheets. We need something that's a little bit more changeable, and we need to move from that lagging system of record to the more real-time or even progressive and predictive system of record, just like any data system ends up evolving, right? So I think what we've done is that we now have a solution for production readiness that is far more elegant, that involves continuous monitoring of all the systems that would make up the checklist and make up the criteria that you would need for readiness. We're ingesting that in real time, and it's a new way of doing this. But it's going to take a second now for the market to catch up and realize, okay, well, we thought we'd sort of solved for this, but we're still having 4-hour-long SWAT calls because it's still really hard to update a spreadsheet, or it's still really hard to update a wiki. Now we need to start thinking about what the next evolution of these systems think like. But again, I want to stress too that this is one of many things that a portal unlocks to you when you get past that initial stage that we're all sort of moving past now. So it's a really good opportunity to be thinking about this stuff right now. What have you unlocked in your business as a result of being more organized about your service catalog?
Yeah. That brings me to my favorite trend of this study. We spent a lot of time talking about how, the earlier slides, folks are doing a lot of different things for production readiness. A lot of folks are having trouble maintaining certain standards. A lot of folks are seeing negative consequences of that. And then when asked, how effective do you think that your production readiness program is overall, the average was a 7 out of 10. And I thought that that was so high, considering a lot of people said, we've seen a lot of negative consequences. We're not doing continuous monitoring. We're having trouble enforcing a lot of different things. But I find that so interesting because I think that that's really indicative of a big gap where folks don't think that this is really a solvable problem right now. I think that tends to be the reaction. People think, yes, I have pain, but I can't see what the solution would be that wouldn't take up a ton more time or really slow my developers down. And therefore, I'm not really willing to compromise. So I think it's about as good as it can be. Any thoughts on that, Justin?
I mean, you nailed it. That is the very definition of an institutionalized or embedded anti-pattern, which I do believe is how the majority of the industry is handling their production readiness assessments now. I think it's an anti-pattern. I think it's ingrained, and I think that like anything else, like any other type of better solution, it's often hard to conceive of that until it's put right in front of you, right? So I think that that there's definitely some stuff that's not correlating here, right? If we have 33% saying that we don't have any process, but then the other 70% thinks everything's great now, that doesn't leave any room for what is the more common middle between the businesses that are trying to get to this point right now. So I think that if anything, this maybe should the takeaway from this for any person who's responsible or is a stakeholder in production readiness is to think about how they would answer this question right now, maybe before and after the content from this webinar, right? My hope is that in sort of understanding that there is another way to do production readiness besides a Slack and besides a SWAT call and besides a spreadsheet and besides a wiki, is that now we would think, okay, well, hold on. Are we doing things as efficiently as possible? Could we be returning a lot of time? Could we be removing a lot of friction from this one point that's important for the value stream, releasing our code so that it can achieve throughput for the business? So I hope that I would actually be super interested to see anybody who filled out this survey, watch the webinar, how they would answer this question again. That I think I'd be very interested with a little bit more insight to what's really available to people.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to note too that there was a little bit of pull apart in that rating there. So everyone generally kind of thinks everything's fine, but some people do feel a little bit more fine than others. And it does tend to be people who are applying continuous monitoring that do feel more strongly that they're in a better place. So if anybody's having trouble with this graph here, what we're looking at in these dark purple here is folks that are continuously monitoring. And then the x-axis here is what they rated on a scale of 1 to 10 for the efficacy of their program. So you're going to see some clustering of the dark up here. Unfortunately, a couple of people over here are doing continuous monitoring and they're still not doing very well, not feeling great. They gave a 2 rating. I feel like those people need help and you should reach out to us and we can help you. But
For sure.
what we're seeing here too is, folks that say that they have no formal process, it's still kind of like a mixed bag. Like we were talking about, there's some people who say we've got no process at all, but I think that we're an 8 and we're doing okay. And maybe they are, it really depends on the size of your organization probably and the problems that you're facing. But I think that's why we're seeing more clustering down here, no continuous monitoring, and we're not doing so well.
Well, I like Tim's observation in the chat too, that asking tough questions results in increased personal workload. That's right. Sometimes if you rock the boat, it's on you to bring the solution. So it could
I wish there was a way to just like bring Tim on stage right now. I don't know if we have that technology and Tim's probably not ready for that right now. So
we'll get there.
Yeah. Last trend here that we want to talk about before we move into how we think that IDPs can help, although we've been talking a bit about that, but we're going to give some more concrete examples and show how you can get to that state no matter where you're at right now. We do still need more than continuous monitoring. We've been talking a ton about the ability to look across all of your standards and making sure that your software is aligned to any standard that you set, regardless of what tool you're using to collect that data. But we did ask a question in the survey, about the level of confidence. And then I split it out to the people that are most confident and the people that are least confident, because I wanted to see if there's some sort of trend happening here in the problems that they're facing. And what we're seeing here is that basically unclear ownership and manual follow-up are pains for pretty much everyone, regardless of how confident you are in your program. These are the 2 big trends, even for those reporting highest confidence in their programs. The thing is, we don't believe that these are unsolvable problems, that there's a way to move forward with this. But Justin, did you see anything interesting in this chart that kind of jumped out at you?
I mean, I think what it does is it shows us, like this data right here shows us kind of what I was hinting at before, which is that when you can do this first thing, which is to unify on a single system of record that has details like ownership and where the stakeholders are tracked in an agile way where they can change, then you unlock all of these other capabilities. I mean, I think this data is just really validating that step zero, should be unification on a service catalog. And then you can start to do all of these really cool cross-functional things that you couldn't do before, that there's just way too much friction in the process to be able to do. And unclear ownership. Really just dialing it back a moment, just simple common sense. You're on that SWAT call. You need to know if this new service that you just migrated from some Kubernetes substrate out to Azure or whatever it is that you're doing is like actually ready, and we can throw public traffic at this, and it's not going to mess up our customers' experience. And you don't even know who's accountable for that service in that moment. It's impossible, right? So yeah, those are these basic steps that I think again are part of the anti-pattern. But when you start to solve for these things, using the service catalog and then ultimately using the portal layer of that service catalog, it's really incredible. These things that seemed like insurmountable problems are suddenly like, oh, it's 30 seconds. I just glance at this readiness report and we're good.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that the ownership piece of it is such a big piece of the puzzle that we haven't really talked about yet, but we will go into that in a second. But I think it also, this screen here, I think adds some more color to the other answers that we've seen, where even if folks are doing continuous monitoring, they still might not feel that great about their program. And in some of those situations, it's because there's a lot of additional burden in making sure that the information is accurate or that the ownership is accurate. The amount of time and legwork to make sure that, oh, this person left the organization 3 years ago, and there's some orphan services. Why didn't we know about this? That's a pain. Or there's an incident and I don't actually know who's responsible for this. And so my MTTR is now going up just because I don't know who to be pinging first. And then the manual follow-up element of it as well. You can have a system where you're collecting all this data in one space. Like if you're using a project management solution and you've got a lot of that data on what's happening and maybe in one space, but then you're still doing okay, now I must go and take action and ping this number of people that are now non-compliant or falling out of alignment with my standards. And that's a huge burden on maybe one person, maybe an engineering manager, maybe on a TPM. I think that those roles tend to feel this a lot as well. But again, we don't think that these are unsolvable problems here. So we think that we need continuously updated ownership. That's probably the number one thing that, even though we didn't spend a ton of time talking about this yet, it's really the baseline for everything, to make sure that you understand who owns what, so that they can be responsible for keeping their software aligned with standards. And that next line is, continuous standards enforcement, make sure there's a way of continuously monitoring across all the software, all the different standards that you have. And then continuous action and reaction. So to make sure there's a cycle going on where, now that we have all this data, now that we know that everything's non-compliant, are we going to be able to do something about it? Do developers have time to do it? Do they know what they have to be doing? Is it a distraction for them? Do they have the tools that they need in order to fix things quickly? And really, those are the three pillars of what internal developer portals solve. They're uniting all engineering data into one place, regardless of where that data is coming from. We're eliminating silos. We're eliminating swivel chairs. So you're not checking one system for one version of ownership and then double checking this other system to say, is that ownership information actually correct? It should all be in one central system of record. The next pillar here, driving continuous alignment to standards. So using all of that data to build what might be called scorecards, where you can set different rules to say, I don't want vulnerabilities to go over this amount. I want to make sure that SLOs are set up. I want to make sure that ownership is set up. We've seen customers build scorecards that are 40 lines long and have multiple different tiers to them of excellence that you want to try and hit. I've also seen scorecards that are 2 rules, make sure it has an owner, make sure it's connected to Git, make sure a repo is set up. And that's kind of it. Let's just start there. Let's just start there to make sure that all of our software is aligned to that bare minimum standard. And then we're going to get a little bit more sophisticated with that. That's a very normal maturity curve. And then the final pillar here is, what are you going to do about that information? You've got to ensure that it's easy for developers to take action quickly. So again, having kind of static standards set up, giving off red alerts over here in the background is not useful at all unless it could be prioritized appropriately. Your developers have the tools they need to actually be successful. Justin,
Yeah,
I kind of monopolized this slide. Go ahead.
No. You hit really all the important points. I think that the one thing that I might add is that this IDPs solving for this problem add like a new layer that you don't get out of some of these other project management tools that we talked about. Even these more advanced ones. You look at something like a Siemens Polarian or an IBM Doors or a Codebeamer, right? They are good in their nuance of understanding the sophistication of the number of players and the code and things like that. They account for the sophistication of the system. What they don't do very well, what they don't deal with very well, are changes, right? And when it comes to something like a readiness standard, agility is so important here because you risk business velocity when the readiness standards don't actually match de-risking the release, or when you can't refine and really optimize for risk and velocity because you have a kludgy tool, right? So I just to me this is one of these just slam dunk no brainer use cases in readiness, especially when you compare it to even the more sophisticated and i.e. more expensive solutions like some of these project management solutions we mentioned.
Yeah. So far we've been probably a little bit abstract, and I wanted to bring it back to some
Mm.
very real world examples. Justin SoFi is a customer of ours, one of the main use cases for security and compliance that still fits into the umbrella of production readiness. Could you talk through kind of what this customer did with Cortex?
Yeah, so I think probably all of us are familiar with Log4Shell. We're still reeling from it as the last major, widespread, easily exploitable vulnerability that impacted almost everybody who wasn't using, one of two open source Java logging libraries. And so this really sent. This was a seismic event when it comes to SaaS and solutions that were using this. The challenge is that because this library log4j, which was made vulnerable by the log4shell exploit, is in so many different packages that it was really difficult for businesses to determine, exactly which bits of software were still using possibly this vulnerable library. So we've seen people do all kinds of crazy solutions, scanning build records and things like that to figure out what version of log4j was picked up in the build. But what was cool about the way that SoFi handled this was that all they really did was just create a scorecard that used an existing code scanner solution that could easily determine whether log4j and a vulnerable version of log4j was present in that code stack. And then they simply just made it part of their readiness requirement. Hey, guess what? If the scanner found that log4j is vulnerable in this release, you can't do the release. It's breaking the readiness standard. So, I mean, this was like people scrambled for weeks, like stopped everything else to get control of this. SoFi was like, what was that noise? I mean, we really just kind of, did this in an afternoon and said, well, this is a really easy criteria to test for and a really easy criteria to put into a scorecard and a really easy scorecard metric to throw into an initiative and drive and actually gate. So no, lots of different solutions to this one, but what an elegant approach here.
Yeah. The next one that we wanted to talk about here was the generic use case of migrations. EOL specifically, I'm going to talk through, but you can really use Cortex to be doing any type of migration. So the case with Outreach here, probably a very common case for other folks, is AWS tends to issue end-of-life notifications for software on the regular. Of course, you have lots of different vendors that are issuing EOL notifications. And of course, if you know this process, you've got to make sure that everybody's moved off the old version onto the new version in a certain amount of time. You usually have a good amount of time to get that work done. But if it doesn't get done in time, you've got to file an exemption. It's a real pain in the ass. So this kind of fell on the TPM at Outreach. And she was very frustrated because this ends up being her full-time job. And this is really not what she signed up to do, just chasing people. So normally she would have to chase people to say, does this affect you? Here's a mass blast email to everybody, mass blast to Slack. Maybe the VP comes over the top and says, hey, everybody, like, let's straighten up and make sure we get this done. And still it doesn't end up getting done. It keeps getting pushed to the back burner. So in using Cortex, it completely changed the way that she does this process. So she makes it super easy to create an initiative for upcoming AWS EOLs. Hey, if your software matches this version of it, you are going to get a notification because your name is against this piece of software that says that you own it. And therefore you need to go and take action in the next 2 weeks or whatever it is. So the outcome really 3 weeks left before the exemption, 96% of all resources were updated. The additional few that she knew about was like, actually, that's fine. We're going to file an exemption for these. But just being able to have that peace of mind to get this done quickly without having to ping anybody directly was just a huge load off.
I mean, look at that. Without a project manager or without a spreadsheet, this is like the ultimate epitome of like solving a really sophisticated problem in an elegant and also self-service way. And I mean, put yourself in the shoes of any type of major cloud, multi-cloud, or cloud migration sort of initiative. All of these different cloud providers are going to process these EOLs a little bit differently, right? AOS is not going to do the same. AWS is not going to do the same thing as Azure. Is not going to do the same thing as Google when you get some of these notifications. So being able to derive a system that can deal with the nuances of multi-cloud very easily, I think is part of the reason that they were able to do this without a project manager, without anyone actually, gatekeeping it. I think it's, again, just really testament to how much more elegant of a solution this is.
We also had another customer, Let's Get Checked, did a migration. They were moving to Kubernetes, and they had, said that they were going to take, I think it was 20 total months was the estimated time that they were going to need for that full migration, and use Cortex to cut it down by 8 months and start accruing or capturing the savings that they were going to get from Kubernetes much faster. Same exact process though, which was, we're looking for this in your software. If it doesn't have it, you're going to get a notification. We're also going to give you a template to make sure that you can create things better from the start. And all that process was handled as like a one-time thing. And then the chief chief, oh, I'm forgetting what his title is, something related to that, was able to kind of monitor real time to make sure that all of that work was getting done. Let's go into one of the last ones here. We're running short on time, Justin, so you might need to breeze through SolarWinds here.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that again, we have in this scenario, SolarWinds actually was exploited, and they were trying to rebuild trust after a breach, and to do that, they were actually trying to define a process that says, all right, look, we messed up, but now we have something that is more formal, and that we can and that we can say with confidence that we think that we are going to be able to align on readiness standards, including making sure that our code's not vulnerable. Look at this, 96 services hit 100% alignment in 6 weeks. This is a multi-month, sometimes full year effort for businesses to totally change the way that they handle solutions like this. 6 weeks, 96 services, 100% alignment. That's amazing.
Yeah. One extra one, just around process optimization. Also, Let's Get Checked here. Something very simple that we talked about early on, which is just like, hey, MTTR is too high. Why is MTTR too high? Well, a lot of the time goes into pinging a very large channel to say, hey, something's happening with this particular service. Who owns this thing? Can someone help me with that? And in that situation where you've got a lot of engineering and you've got a lot of people saying, I want to be able to help, but actually I'm doing this other thing right now, so I can't be the one to respond. I'm sure somebody else will, and then nobody ends up doing that. But this took care of that, so that the support team could immediately see, I've got an issue with this thing. I know who the owner is. I know who the on-call person is. I know who to go to for this, because I can see what channel I'm supposed to actually be pinging that's in a smaller group, and get things done significantly faster. And just that alone, they said, helped improve their MTTR by 67%. So there's a lot of different value that could be derived from an IDP. We talked about a couple different use cases here. All of these kind of relate to production readiness, though. And again, those three core things of making sure you have consistent ownership, making sure that you have consistent application of standards, and consistently enabling your team to be able to take action on those things quickly. So it's not just passive standards in the background that are kind of blowing up the alert screen. That's it. I know we just breezed through those last two here. I really did not think we were going to take up the full 45 minutes. Well, we're at 44 minutes technically. We'd love for y'all to check out the email that you're going to get tomorrow, a copy of the slides and the recording, of course. Click through demo and production readiness that we have for you that's in the Cortex environment. A ton of other resources on this topic too, if this is interesting to you. Of course, Justin and I are always available if y'all have questions. You can reach us, justin.riak@cortex.io, lauren.craigie@cortex.io as well. Justin, anything else to say here?
No, I think this is really great. I hope that everyone has kind of come away thinking, this is not an unsolvable problem. There are elegant solutions for this. It is a really new way of thinking about it, but part of the reason that I'm so excited to be here is that we're solving what I believe is an old problem, but I think with a much better approach.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time, Justin. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good rest of the day.